Absolutely. So ecocide is kind of broadly used to mean mass damage and destruction of ecosystems in the same way that, say, genocide might describe the destruction of a people, or homicide is destroying a person, in other words, murder. So that's a very kind of general definition, I think, that's broadly used. I mean, we actually use a kind of working definition that includes also the fact that this would be widespread, severe, or systematic or long term, and committed with knowledge of the risks as well. Absolutely. So, and the background was actually several years of working on this concept and publicizing it and moving it forward on the part of Polly Higgins, with whom I began this campaign. And the idea was simply to answer the question, how do we create a legal duty of care for the earth? And the conclusion that Polly came to was that the protective law that was needed was not in place, and that criminal law creates that level of protection. So, in the same way as you can have a right to life, but unless killing you is a crime, your right to life isn't protected. In the same way, ecocide as a crime could act as a protective law for the natural systems on which we all depend. So that's the kind of overall purpose of it. And the birth of the campaign itself happened really as a result of us discovering over some years that normal foundation funding was not easily available. So actually, moving this work forward at the diplomatic level was difficult because it was seen as quite a sort of extreme solution. It was seen as a sort of high risk in terms of support. But what we realized is that when you talk to the grassroots level, people really profoundly understood that this was needed. And so it was a question of bringing together my background in campaigning, Polly's in law, and bringing this together as a public campaign so that we could raise some funds to actually keep this moving at the diplomatic level. Well, the international level of crime, and particularly the Rome Statute, which governs the current 4 international crimes, is aimed at people in positions of superior responsibility. So it's aimed at key decision makers. In the same way as with a crime of genocide, you're not aiming at the foot soldiers, but at the people who are controlling the situation. The same would be true of ecocide. So it's really aimed at the top level. It's aimed at decision makers, for example, could be CEOs, could be financiers, could be government ministers, for example. And in terms of who it's aimed at, I mean, one of the key reasons for approaching this at the international level, and there are actually a number of reasons which are worth going into a little bit, but one of them is that the biggest polluters are transnational corporations and their supply chains, and essentially, in order to reach those particular actors, if you like, you need a law that works across borders, because otherwise those corporations can simply move their operations or their activities between jurisdictions according to what seems most favorable to them. So in order to create a kind of broad base of the possibility to prosecute in those contexts, it's important to aim for the international level. But I think there's a couple of other reasons why that's very important, actually. I mean, one of them is simply the mechanism of the International Criminal Court, because it's the only global mechanism that directly accesses the criminal justice systems of its members. So it enables you to create a level of coherence, because if a country ratifies a crime there, it must also include it in its domestic legislation. So you can create a kind of coherence across borders, which again is very important in this instance. And also, it ultimately, although getting that in place potentially could take longer than passing a law in an individual jurisdiction, in the longer term it's actually more efficient, because you don't end up with a kind of piecemeal situation where there are possibly different definitions in different countries and so on. So we see it as actually ultimately the most efficient route to creating a rule that applies across borders. I think that the simple answer to that is it isn't. But I think also the positive answer to that is that actually our system is already aware. I mean, the major actors in our system are deeply aware that sort of seismic drastic change is needed. And not only that, but, certainly in the corporate sustainability sphere, there are a lot of companies now that are starting to try and do the right thing. And even some of the worst actors are changing their narrative to at least make gestures towards the idea that they might be doing the right thing. They might have to move towards sustainability. So this is not something that's going to come as a surprise to anybody. And what is really most important in this is that we don't try to make this happen immediately. I mean, obviously we also don't want it to take too long. This decade's going to be decisive, and if we want to meet Paris targets, if we want to meet Sustainable Development Goals, some kind of parameter has to be put in place to help that happen. And for us, that's what ecocide law does. It creates a kind of parameter, a kind of a guardrail to keep corporate practice, to steer it within a safe operating space, but not to do it immediately overnight. Because, I mean, and this is another reason for aiming at the international level, because if you bring in a law in a single jurisdiction, I mean, actually governments are quite reluctant to do that. And the one government that has recently done that, which is France, is finding it difficult and has had to water down the definition of ecocide quite a bit just in order to get it through. Now, and there's an obvious reason for that, is that you've got economic relationships and contracts in place, and those things, to suddenly criminalize people that you've been working with perfectly happily up till now is actually a really difficult and chaotic thing to do. And so, but if you're moving this forward at the international level, there are certain steps in the procedure that have to take place, and those take time. And effectively what you create with that is a kind of compliance period. So, you know that you have to bring, a lot of countries with you in order to move this forward. So there's a kind of safety in numbers factor, but also the fact that it will take a certain amount of time. I mean, we estimate possibly altogether maybe around 5 years, which actually for changing international law is remarkably fast. But let's say, that is a period that it could take. That actually starts to make, it flags it up to the economic world, flags it up to the political world. Already this conversation is growing very fast. And once a state or a small group of states, ideally, is prepared to actually propose this amendment to the Rome Statute, which is the governing document for the International Criminal Court, once that proposal is there, this is on the horizon. And I think that when people really dig a little bit, they realize that something like this is going to have to come into play at some point. And in fact, insurance companies were saying to Polly Higgins some years ago, we know this is coming. It's just a question of when. So the fact that the conversation is growing fast, the fact that, a state may be willing to put something like this on the table and propose it, maybe even as early as next year, we'll see how this pans out. I mean, obviously, it's never 100% guaranteed with diplomatic work, but things have been moving quite fast. So yes, as soon as that comes onto the horizon, there's a really strong signal then that goes to, all sort of the points in that production chain. So the financiers, the insurers. I mean, the fact is, if something's a crime, you can't insure it. You can't insure murder. I mean, you can't go to your government and get a permit for mass killing. Just, it's not possible. It's criminal. So when you've got this perspective of going beyond just environmental regulation, which is where actually most environmental law still sits, when you're going beyond that to actually criminal law, you're actually looking at a complete change in the ground rules. So that's something that then will have to be adapted to over time. But as I say, not over too much time. We don't have too much time. Absolutely. So we have already 6 ICC member states that have a recorded interest in some way at the government level for, taking this conversation, into the state arena. And the first 2 of those were small island states, which of course are at the sharp end of the effects of climate change, and so very clearly have an incentive to be looking at the root causes of that. And that was Vanuatu and the Maldives, who brought it up at the international International Criminal Court at the end of 2019, and called for the member states to seriously discuss it. Then we have support from France. Emmanuel Macron very concretely expressing his wish to champion this at the international level, particularly at the International Criminal Court. And moving on from France, also Belgium, which has actually incorporated a pledge into its government programme to take diplomatic action around halting ecocide crime. And they've been the first European country to raise it at the International Criminal Court, which happened just a couple of months ago in December. The Finnish Foreign Ministry has also expressed support. The Finnish Foreign Minister submitted a special video message to a side event on ecocide in December at the ICC. So that was a very concrete gesture. And then we also have support from Spain in the sense that their Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee voted very strongly to recommend to the Spanish government to also consider looking at ecocide legislation nationally and internationally. But that's just the beginning, in the sense that, as you may know, we're convening a panel of top international criminal lawyers to draw up a legally robust definition of ecocide that could actually be used by interested states to propose at the International Criminal Court. And that is something that hasn't been done before. There have been working definitions, but this is the first time that this has been done in response actually to a request from parliamentarians, in this case from Sweden, parliamentarians from both the ruling parties, who contacted our foundation and said, obviously you have the connections and you have allies with the expertise for this. Are you able to show us a definition that that we could consider, that could be reviewed? And that enabled us to pull together an extraordinarily talented and experienced legal panel to do this. And they're working on that definition over the next few months. So that will emerge in June is their plan to report back with a definition. Now, what that will enable us to do is to reach out to a much wider group of states potentially around the world, and to consider this and take it forward. And we already have interest from, I think it's 11 other parliamentarians from 11 other countries are already interested in seeing that definition when it emerges. So the conversation is really growing quite fast around this, and it'll be very interesting to see how that moves forward once the definition emerges, because I think that it will gather momentum again at that stage. The case was dubbed l'affaire du siècle, or the affair of the century, and it was supported by 4 different NGOs, including Greenpeace in France, and also an NGO called Notre Affaire à tous, which means it's all of our business, which was founded by one of our key associates in France and advisory board members, Valérie Cabanès.
Vous avez gagné. L'inaction climatique de l'État est jugée illégale.
Avec l'affaire du siècle, nous venons ensemble de faire condamner l'État pour inaction climatique.
Et ça, c'est une victoire historique, inédite pour le climat et la planète.
Rappelez-vous, tout a commencé il y a un peu plus de 2 ans.
On a attaqué l'État en justice pour inaction climatique.
Nous avons été plus de 2 300 000 à nous mobiliser pour l'affaire du siècle.
Campaigned very strongly in the Francophone countries for ecocide over many years, and this case was around climate and around what the government was doing to actually meet the targets that it has set itself, and it was essentially found wanting in its track record of actually taking action to meet the targets that it had set itself as one of the European members of the signees of the Paris Agreement. And there are further developments still to happen in the case, but what has already been established is that yes, the French government has a responsibility to stick to those targets. Yes, it has failed to do so, and yes, it's potentially responsible for consequent ecological damage. And that is, and for that reason, it's a landmark ruling. I mean, it's not the first case where a government has been held to account for climate inaction. So that happened both in Holland with the Erkende case, which first came to light in 2015 and had its final appeal upheld last year, I believe. But there was also a case in Ireland as well, where the government's climate policy was deemed inadequate, and they were actually mandated to come up with something better. So it's the third in a sequence of what we imagine is going to be a lot more cases as well, of governments being held directly to account by civil society actors in terms of their responsibility to their populations and to future generations. So it's a really important win. It's not finished yet. There will be more developments to the case, but this initial victory is very important. Wow, I mean that's a wonderful question. I mean, we believe we see ecocide law as kind of a bridging piece, really from an old and dysfunctional system into one that actually operates in harmony with nature. So of course we're not under any illusion that this one rule will change everything, but we also think that without it will be hard to change anything. So it's kind of a sort of bridging piece, because I mean, if you think about it, if you're campaigning for sort of human rights or social justice, you've at least got the reassurance that mass murder is a crime, and so you've got some kind of foundation against which to build. But at the moment in the environmental world, there isn't that really fundamental sort of red line that's being drawn. So you can still go to a government and ask for a permit for fracking. You can't go and ask for a permit for killing. So changing that really has the possibility to change the whole mindset of how we approach our economy, how we approach our infrastructure, how we approach the way we do things, and how we relate to nature. So the idea really is to move from harm to harmony, and if you can put destruction of nature beneath that moral red line so that it becomes unacceptable, then you also start to change the way that people conceive of themselves in relation to nature. Because at the moment, our laws protect property, or our criminal laws protect around harm to people, but they don't make an equivalence. And so we don't, we have this long history, centuries and centuries of thinking of ourselves as separate to nature and dominating nature, certainly in the Western paradigm, which currently, dominates globally. And it dominates because it's a philosophy of domination, and so it ends up dominating. Whereas actually, if we look, for example, at the indigenous ways of life, and it's very important to do this in this context because 80% of the world's biodiversity is stewarded by indigenous communities, and that's no coincidence. It's because they have a really strong a deep awareness of the value of nature and our relatedness to nature, and so there's something about criminalizing destruction of nature that acknowledges something that those ancient ways of living acknowledge as a matter of course, which is that if you damage Mother Earth, there are consequences. That's not something we decide in our heads. That's a fact. We're seeing it around us all the time, in fact, in ever more apocalyptic ways. And so acknowledging that and actually incorporating that as part of our legal system just gives a kind of a fulcrum or a shift that we believe can really enable a different approach to come into play, so that all business activities will now have an additional bottom line. How do I carry out my business without killing anybody is already there. Okay, so how do I carry out my business without destroying ecosystems? And actually, when you start asking that question, it becomes what I hope, and what we at Stop Ecocide we really hope is going to be a welcome challenge. It's like, this is we need to move the world to a different place. How do we operate with this new parameter in place? And I think we'll start to see some really, really huge changes, and really positive ones.